It's a time of tense relations between traditional allies. Threats at home and abroad. And with an ongoing war next door, is Turkey setting its sights on a deeper friendship with Russia? Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan met his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin in Sochi on Monday, the latest step towards fully restoring ties. Moscow and Ankara fell out over this, when Turkey shot down a Russian jet after it violated its airspace in November 2015. Russia responded by freezing diplomatic ties, imposing economic sanctions, and banning Russian tourists from coming here to Turkey. But in June 2016, President Erdogan extended an olive branch, expressing his condolences for the incident.
Хочу отметить в начале нашей встречи, что наши отношения можно считать восстановленными практически в полном объеме.
Ülkelerimizin ve halklarımızın her alanda daha yakın ve güçlü işbirliği içinde olması noktasında iki tarafta hemfikir.
But how will seeking a closer relationship with Russia go down with Turkey's NATO allies? Turkey and Russia's relationship has increasingly involved a military element, recently cooperating on operations to create de-escalation zones in Syria. And now Turkey has agreed to a $2.4 billion deal to buy a long-range anti-aircraft missile system from Moscow. The S-400 can support multiple range intercept missiles, capable of destroying targets from 40 to 250 kilometres away. The US Patriot system supports just one interceptor missile with a range of 96 kilometres. But this deal has angered NATO members, in part because the S-400 won't work with other NATO systems. The NATO Military Committee chairman has said the principle of sovereignty operates when buying military equipment, but the countries are sovereign both when making a decision and when facing the consequences of that decision. How will Turkey's relationship with Russia impact its relationship with NATO? And will Ankara's desire to defend itself lead to more enhanced military ties with Moscow? Yvette McCullough, the Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from London is Alexander Kocharov. He's a head researcher on Europe and former Soviet republics for IHS Markit, a financial services company. From Washington, D.C. is Nicholas Harras. He's a senior analyst at the Center for a New American Security. And with me here in the studio is Emre Erşen. He's a professor of international relations at Marmara University. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Emre Erşen, let me begin with you. Turkey and Russia coming closer together, has it been a natural gravitation or has it been hard work?
It has been hard work, actually, especially if we consider what happened between the two countries 2 years ago, the fighter jet crisis. Well, in the 2000s, the relations actually improved gradually and very deliberately. The two countries actually tried to make good neighbors out of each other. But the fighter jet crisis put an end to it. But now, actually, they are trying to repair that relationship. And more or less, they actually achieved it. And we can understand this from their dialogue in Syria. They're working very closely in Syria. The economic relations are improving. The S-400 deal that we talked about before is about to be finalized. So when you take a look at the map, the picture of Turkish-Russian relations, it's definitely on the right path. But of course, there are some significant disagreements as well.
Yeah, we'll be straddling a few of these things. So you mentioned Syria. You mentioned missiles. We're going to talk about NATO and general geopolitical trends and business as well. Nicholas Harras, is Turkey's turn towards Russia, Erdogan's turn closer to Putin, does that mean that it has to come at the expense of Turkey's relationship with the Europeans and the Americans?
I don't think so. I mean, particularly from the perspective of Washington, there has been a sense since the beginning of the Trump administration that there needs to be a condominium of sorts between all the different actors when it comes to the Syrian conflict in particular. And the engagement between Erdogan and Putin has been positive, particularly in the context of the Astana process, in trying to get a workable de-escalation zone scheme that can wind down the war in Syria and can work towards stability. I think the more thorny issue is, of course, the S-400 system, and that is going to be a much more difficult discussion, particularly in the context of NATO. But I would say, from the view from Washington, is any type of Turkish-Russian engagement in Syria is positive.
Okay, so let's talk about Syria for a moment. Alexander, given that Turkey and Russia talking and thrashing things out at Astana and elsewhere, it might be taking the sting out of the war in Syria, if not ending the war. Is that positive?
Well, you know, Russia has been involved in Syria for the past 2 years, and it sees its role as, it views its role in Syria as largely positive, with the significant removal of the Islamic State controlled areas from significant parts of the country. Turkey understands the dynamic very well, and it understands that it needs to be on the same side with Russia if it wants to achieve its own objectives in Syria. This is clearly has to deal with the Kurdish-controlled areas in the north and particularly northwest of the country. Turkey understands very well that in order to achieve its objectives, it needs to talk to Putin, to Russia, because Russia controls a lot of the situation on the ground in Syria.
Emre Erşen, does that suggest a kind of begrudging maturity in the Turkish approach to Syria, whereas a few years ago it was a bit more bullish about everything, whereas now it's going, okay, there's a list of possibly bad options, let's take the least bad option and work with the Russians, even though we disagree with the Russians fundamentally in terms of them backing Assad and so on. Is that a more pragmatic Turkish foreign policy on Syria?
Well, I think so, because, you know, we have to see the relationship between Turkey and Russia also in the light of Turkey's ongoing partnership with NATO and the West. And when it comes to that, Turkey also has significant problems with the United States currently. We know that. And when it comes to the YPG especially, because this is the major problem of Turkey in Syria, I think Turkey believes Russia is a much more pragmatic partner, especially in dealing with the YPG. So Turkey believes there is some room of improvement for satisfies Turkey's needs when it comes to the YPG, especially if it continues this dialogue with Russia as well as Iran. And as we know, currently Turkey, Russia and Iran are actually cooperating in the region of Idlib. And Turkey's cooperation in Idlib is extremely important for both Moscow and Tehran. But Turkey's expectation at the same time is to extend this cooperation to Afrin, the region which is controlled by the YPG. And I think currently Turkey believes the cooperation with Russia and Iran is the best way to go. It's the most pragmatic or the realistic way to achieve these goals in Syria.
Yeah, interesting. Nicholas Harras, I live in Istanbul, and listening to Turkish people, they feel somewhat belittled by the Americans, especially when they hear the American justification, for example, in terms of arming the YPG, where the Americans say, well, you know what, we've given them the weapons and they've got serial numbers on them, they're going to give them back to us when it's all done, don't worry about it. That kind of thing is laughed at here, and maybe the Turks see the Russians as a better partner in a place like Syria. How's that going to go down in a place like Washington? Does it just diminish Washington's influence in the Middle East, whereas in the past other countries didn't have a choice, but now countries like Turkey have a choice in terms of who they deal with?
So the U.S. has consistently said that it views Turkey is having a strong role when it comes to winding down the conflict in Syria. And if we expand beyond Syria, Turkey, particularly in the realm of humanitarian assistance and other engagement, has been a very positive actor in the Horn of Africa, in the Arabian Peninsula, and in Libya, in North Africa, and other areas. If we go back to Syria, I mean, the U.S. has taken a region-by-region approach when it comes to the EPG and the wider Syrian Democratic Forces coalition. In the particular context of Afrin, where you have less U.S. connectivity with those particular constituent militias of the EPG, and you have a strong presence of Russia and the Assad government in northwest Syria, is of course natural that Turkey and Russia and Iran, to a lesser extent, would engage on the topic of the EPG and winding down the conflict there in northern and western Syria. In northern and eastern Syria, of course, the U.S. is going to be engaged with the Syrian Democratic Forces coalition, and my understanding is the Trump administration continues countries to seek to engage with Turkey on helping to build out the stabilization mission in areas west of the Euphrates River, in particular in the area of Raqqa, where Turkey can play a very positive role in rebuilding and reconstructing that city. And just one point on sort of U.S. influence on the ground, I think we have to keep in mind that right now the U.S. is directly in control or has strong influence over almost a third of Syrian territory. And Turkey, through its Euphrates Shield Zone and its potential zone in Idlib, could have a direct territorial control over an area of Syria larger than the size of the U.S. state of Delaware. So combined, the U.S. and Turkey have significant leverage on the ground in Syria, and that will have consequences not only for winding down the Syrian civil war, but for broader Middle East security.
Emre, do they still need each other, the U.S. and Turkey, when it comes to a place like Syria, even though Turkey's maybe finding it easier to do business with the likes of Russia?
Well, we're talking about two NATO partners currently. So I think militarily speaking, Turkey definitely wants to be closer to the United States and its traditional Western partners rather than Russia. Yes, Russia is a very important neighbor of Turkey. And when it comes to Syria, Turkey sees Russia as a much more influential power. But in the final analysis, we know that when it comes to the solution of the Syrian crisis, it's all about the dialogue going on between Washington and Moscow. And Turkey is aware of that.
But if Turkey wants to strengthen that NATO alliance, why, from the NATO perspective, is it thumbing its nose at its allies by purchasing those S-400 surface-to-air missiles? It's saying, we want to do business with the Russians. We're going to buy missiles from them. We don't care. You heard Petr Pavel, the head of NATO's military committee. He wasn't happy. General Mattis wasn't happy. Turkey's gone ahead with it anyway. So why is it doing that? Why is it sort of poking the NATO alliance by doing business with the Russians in terms of these missiles?
Well, I think in terms of this deal, I mean, the debate about the S-400 deal, we are talking about the technical details, and I believe that Turkey definitely needs to reinforce its national defense because it's such a volatile region. But I think the political implications of this deal are much more important currently than the technical details, and I believe Turkey is actually trying to give a deliberate message to its Western allies, and that it has other options. Because, as you know, when Turkey started its plans for developing its national missile defense system, it started a few years ago, and NATO and the NATO countries didn't really want to give that system to Turkey, or they didn't actually want to share their technology, or they were against the co-production. And I think by using this S-400 thing on the table, I mean, keeping it on the table is quite useful for Turkey in terms of its political dealings with NATO and the United States.
Right. Okay, so political victory. Alexander, is it a political victory for Vladimir Putin in creating more of a crack in the NATO alliance by selling these missiles to key NATO member Turkey?
Well, obviously, Russia views it as a very positive development because, you know, ideally the Kremlin would like to see NATO or the EU crumble, all these Western structures which Russia sees as views as very hostile towards Russia. So whatever they can do, even creating these little cracks, is something that would be viewed as a very positive development by Moscow. And this is exactly the reason why Putin feels drawn towards Erdogan. All the complexities in Turkey's recent relationship with the West obviously bringing these two men together.
Is there a fear, Nicholas, in Washington that the West is going to lose Turkey?
I don't get that sense. The sense that we have here in Washington is that although the sale of that missile system to Turkey by Russia is an irritant in the U.S., Turkish, and the broader Turkish-NATO relationship, the fact of the matter is that Turkey is a sovereign country, and it is part of NATO as a sovereign country. And there is an awareness here in Washington that although the U.S. and Turkey have had some troubles recently in the relationship continues to be strong. There's a lot of engagement, particularly in the economic and also in the cultural exchange realm. And that, you know, the U.S. has a mature perspective that Turkey also has to manage its relationship with its neighbors, whether it's Iran or whether it's Russia. And there could be some potential benefits for Turkey by keeping Vladimir Putin at bay, by throwing him a bone with the sale of the missile system.
Yeah, interesting point there, Emre. Do others not understand it well enough that Turkey has to live in this region and has to border the Syrians and the Iranians and be close to the Russians and so on? Because Nicholas mentioned that. He says there's an understanding that Turkey has to deal with its neighbors. Is there really an understanding, or has there been an understanding up until now?
Well, I think Turkey is a little bit disappointed about this issue when it comes to its debates with its Western allies. And I think the general belief in Turkey and the Turkish government and also the Turkish public is that so far the Western allies have failed to appreciate Turkey's position in this region. Turkey is living in a very hard region, and of course it has to have a special relationship with Russia, especially after the military intervention of Russia back in 2015. But I think the thing here is to keep the dialogue channels open, because when they are closed, I think in Turkey's case, Turkey knows that it has to deal with both Russia and its NATO partners at the same time. So that dialogue is very important. And from time to time, I think there are significant misunderstandings, especially in the Turkish public, about the United States perceptions about the situation in Syria and also the Turkish national security interests there.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so as we step back and we look at everything with a bird's eye view, we look at trade, we look at security, we look at the geography and the geopolitics. Alexander, when you look at Turkey and Russia, who do you think needs whom more?
I think, both countries are tactically required to have this relationship, while strategically they can be easily viewed as regional competitors, because both are fundamentally regional powers who are vying for more influence in the region. They need this relationship because they both depend on trade and economic issues. Russia needs a market for its energy. It wants to sell more gas to Turkey and via Turkey to Europe. It needs a market for its nuclear technology, and it's very interested in completion of the project in Turkey. But also Turkey needs a market for its agribusiness. It needs a market for its tourism industry, and Russia can provide these markets. So it is a mutually beneficial relationship, which from the economic standpoint makes a lot of sense. And this is what we see. There is a lot of pragmatism in this relationship recently.
Emre, do you agree with that? They both need each other equally?
I think they do currently. I mean, yes, we talk about all these economic relations, energy, and etc., but there's also a very significant geopolitical aspect of it, and Syria is only one dimension of that. And we can also talk about the cooperation in the Black Sea, which is extremely important for Russia, at least. Yes, Syria currently is equally important for both of them, but when it comes to Black Sea, when it comes to the Caucasus, the two countries are quite influential regional players, and I think they both saw this, and they took this lesson after the fighter jet crisis. During the period when the relations were completely suspended, I think both Russia and Turkey understood that they need each other when it comes to regional issues, apart from all these very significant economic links, energy, tourism, and etc.
Nicholas, not just the Turks, not just the Russians, maybe the Iranians, maybe the Saudis and so on. Are we going to see all of these countries become a bit more proactive in the years to come? Because it might be that Washington is untangling itself, extricating itself from the region?
There is definitely a movement towards all these various regional actors taking a unilateral approach to their policies in the Middle East and its near abroad. I would say, though, that the U.S. continues to maintain a very strong force presence in the Gulf, and the U.S. continues to maintain its strategic alliances with various different actors in the region, particularly Turkey, and you could see an expansion of the U.S. presence, in fact, in Syria, and a presence that lasts for years to come. So rather than say that the U.S. is sort of withdrawing itself from the region, what I would say is that the U.S. is now in a reality where there's a multipolar dynamic. And the U.S. is best served as sort of serving as a coordinating actor where all these different actors circle around.
Okay. Gentlemen, it's been good to have the conversation. Nicholas Harras, Alexander Kocherov, and Emre Erşen. I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers.